face that's sitting on my right, Jim Colby. Some of you are familiar with him because he's now a SID-Washington board member, and we're very pleased that when he left Congress, on his own decision, let me say, to join our community, to join the private life, that he also joined the SID-Washington board, and we've been very honored and very grateful for his presence and his participation in the board. He's also now currently the Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund and co-chair of the Transatlantic Task Force on Development, which a year ago, many of you haven't, was a really pioneering report really on the subject of finding the common ground where we're headed in foreign assistance. Many of you, though, will also remember him in Congress, and he brought to the congressional debate, the discussion, and the Foreign Appropriations Committee, Foreign Ops, which is so important to this community, the well-being of all of the countries and alleviating poverty. He brought with it a model of building consensus and bridging differences, enabling people to get their heads around the needs for development and the needs beyond the politics that often surround foreign assistance. An extraordinary man who brought his own views, didn't hesitate to share them, shared them on economic development, but opened the space to ensure that social and economic development issues were being explored together and reached across the aisles, and set a tradition that actually today, even in 2010, when almost every other area of investment and concern in our country and maybe internationally is divided between the aisles and not brought together across the aisles. But he is really a leader who champions the opportunity for us to be able to move forward constructively, positively, with understanding between each other, and become pragmatic and practical in our way forward. And without further ado, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Jim Colby, who will chair our session this afternoon and introduce the other speakers of the panel. Jim, thank you very, very much.
Steve, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. My thanks to all of you for being here. This has been an exciting conference, and we still have a ways to go, so more excitement, we hope, this afternoon. I want to welcome you all to this afternoon panel discussion, which I think clearly mirrors the sub-theme of the entire conference, which is new development paradigms for 2020, 2010 and beyond, maybe 2020 also, for 2010 and beyond. I was interested at the lunch in listening to one of the questioners who said there's a clear desire he was hearing at this conference of people to change things, to move on from the past. And yet I think sometimes we find ourselves mired in that past. And when we think of our current development thinking, our current development infrastructure, we still find, at least here in the United States and I think elsewhere around the world, mired in the way we were doing things 25 or 30 years ago, mired in an era of the Cold War. But so much has changed since that time. The political landscape in the world is completely different than what we found in 1985, to use a benchmark year perhaps. The economic crisis of 2008 and 9, from which we are only slowly emerging today, has altered the development landscape in many ways in both the donor and the recipient countries. There is a tremendous demand of countries to control their own destinies, and hence the direction of the aid within those countries that we didn't have before. There is a demand on the part of donors and the citizens of the recipient countries for much greater transparency than we used to know in the past. There is a radical shift in the sources of aid from overseas development assistance or official development assistance to foreign direct investment, to the private sources. There is the emergence of new donors, the countries such as China, Brazil, South Africa, India, which were not players at all on the scene even just a handful of years ago. There is a much greater emphasis today on food security, driven by the G8 decisions that have been made at L'Aquila. And there are the new challenges that we didn't have a few decades ago, challenges of climate change, of different kinds of diseases in the world. All of this has changed the landscape. And so that's what we want to explore today, is some of these new paradigms, and to put them in the context of today's development realities. To do that, we have three exceptionally well-qualified individuals from different backgrounds and different experiences. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak, but not give you any detailed biography or intros. I think you have those in the program. First, we will be hearing this afternoon, giving us a perspective from the World Bank and from Africa, Togo Gaiweya from McIntosh, who is the executive director at the World Bank. Togo has held many posts in the Liberian government and advised many other African governments on development and financial issues. He is deeply involved in development in that continent. Second, we're going to hear from Kang Ho Park, who gives us a Korean and a Policy Institute initiative. Kang Ho is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute, where he focuses on emerging donors and global development partnership issues. He's seconded there or on leave from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea, where he has been asked to come and look at these issues in preparation for the high-level forum on effectiveness in Seoul, which will be held there next year. And third, finally, we will hear from Anne-Marie Slaughter, giving a U.S. government perspective. Anne-Marie, who I've had many occasions to work with before, is the Director of Policy Planning at the United States State Department. She's been a professor of international and comparative law at institutions such as Harvard, Chicago, the Kennedy School, and most recently as Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And I might add that Anne-Marie will have to leave at 3:45, a little bit before we end the panel, and so please don't be disappointed if she leaves the stage. We will call for questions for her, perhaps when we begin that part of the session. So the questions we would want to see them explore here today is which of the paradigms that they see are going to be the transformative ones, those that are going to be enduring. These I would call, in the parlance of military planners, the known unknowns. What other changes might we anticipate in the future that we haven't even thought about, the unknown unknowns? How best can we harness the new opportunities that we have before us today? And what does it all mean for the practitioners of development, many of which are assembled here in this room today? So these are some of the questions that we want to address, but I'm sure they will also take us in new directions. And so let me begin with Togo.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm very much happy to be here and to be a part of this exchanging of knowledge and exchanging of ideas, and more so, people of goodwill who have gathered to see how the world can be made a much more better place for all of us. I was listening to our moderator, and I'm trying to see how he wanted to confine, of course, what's on paper, how we say it. But I'm going to be very brief, picking up a strong sentence that I really believe in when it comes to the question of new development paradigm. I am saying, from my perspective, a proposition. The debate, and I will want to confine my interventions basically to Africa, and it's true I'm the executive director from the bank, but sometimes we want, cases like this, we want to be as original in our own thoughts than to speak on behalf of the World Bank. So let me just talk as me and the way I reflect on these kind of matters, more so as what we say and do in our boardroom. Now, the debate on African development challenges, in my view, have not changed. The debate itself have not changed, and I will make some comments on that. What has changed, however, are the focus and elements of the debate, particularly when it comes to the question of the opportunities that we all have to move the continent and the world forward. So the change that we're talking about in this paradigm shift, new change, 2010 and beyond, has nothing to do in my mind of the debate itself. That debate has been going on for a very long time. Somewhere in the 80s, the 1980s, Africa was faced with all these socio-economic crises, and we began to find answers to how we get out of those crises. We were basically trying to establish and position ourselves with a development crisis rather than a socio-economic crisis. And if we begin to reflect deeply on those 2 points that I've just made, the development crisis vis-a-vis the socio-economic crisis, it is in that former that this new shift, this new paradigm shift, is focusing all of its attention. The case was made then, as it is being made today, that countries have failed to choose and to establish appropriate and effective strategies and policies, and what I usually call tactics, because you got your strategy, you got your policies, but I think somehow in delivering those, you have to be tactical in doing what you have to do. And all of these things were debated with the view of bringing about economic, social, and political transformation. These were debates in the 80s. Every corridor that I went in, these were the debates we were all engaged with. Events over the years, particularly the ones of recent times, the whole question of the financial crisis that took place not only in Asia, but that came across into the United States and other developed countries, have no doubt pushed the development debate into another direction, but still recognizing and making the same point. The issue should be seen as a development crisis rather than a socio-economic crisis. The first proposition I would like to make, therefore, is that today's challenges are the same as yesterday's challenges were. And tomorrow's challenges will not be significantly different from today's development challenges. Let's think about that. The challenges of yesterday are just about the same development challenges of today. The development challenges of tomorrow will be just the same development challenges that we have. So making the strategic choice of response to adequately address the challenges of the day is where Africa has gone wrong. Helping Africa to make the right choice and to target its response accordingly is where our international friends have shortchanged the region. Moving beyond 2010, these wrongs need to be made right. A key point here is that, be it the choice of strategy or the choice of policy instruments, the effectiveness of the choice depends on 3 very quick factors: harmonious and interconnected international pattern of specialization and division of labor. The number of actors playing around in this development paradigm have increased, and they have diversified in their approaches and their engagements. New actors, new coalitions, and new agendas, new expectations, and very responsive mechanisms are creeping up every day. Second, the extent to which the African leaders themselves, the people of those countries, and our development partners are willing and equipped to strike the necessary balance between equity and growth. That is at the root of this new thinking. And 3, every actor should have a clear understanding of the development issues of the time. Lack of this understanding will distort the outcomes of the choice of a development strategy or a choice of a development policy for that matter. Now, I have mentioned what changed over time quickly were the elements of the debate. And let me just use my last 5 minutes to point that. Several intervening factors have led to the change. The nature, the complexities, the effectiveness of these factors are the underpinning rationale for the growing call for a new development paradigm shift as we go beyond 2010. Arguments for or against these factors are adequately covered in the literature. So let me confine myself to one and final statement that I would like to make on this podium. One size does not fit all. One size of shoes, of shirt, of dress, of whatever does not fit all of us in this room. So as we move beyond 2010, our development partners would need to diagnose the African development problem much better than has been the case. What is the problem? Or are there many development problems in Africa? As often claimed, you read the literature and it will list a whole page of problems called development problems. Is there a common outlook on the nature of the development problem of Africa? Is there any difference between the development problem of Africa and, say, that of the more developed world? I am convinced that if these questions and other related questions were put to a cross-section of policymakers, policy formulators, rural subsistence farmers, informal urban entrepreneurs, university authorities, major external donors, and village leaders, it will put the same question to each one of these clusters of people, I suspect we will be given a diverse range of answers. So let us reflect a little on what is more often than not, in my mind, is an issue of illusion and inefficiency when the development problem of Africa is being addressed. Could it, for example, and I want to just pose this, let's think deep as I pose this question. Could it, for example, be said that a 4-year-old child who is asked to give the correct answer to the inscription 2 + 2, is that a problem when the head of a household wakes up in the middle of the night to ponder over meeting the morning, the incoming day's family needs in the middle of the night? If a household, head of the household gets up, begin to worry about tomorrow when the sun rises, what will my family eat? Is that a problem? Could we enlarge the case at hand and say that a nation, population, do have a problem when they have to solve the welfare function, which involves putting together, in a sequential manner, specific development inputs. And this is where I think some of these debates are headed towards, for optimal management and utilization of national resources. The point here is that problem identification is a relative issue. What is a development problem to A may not be a problem to B. While finding the solution to 2 + 2 = what could be a problem for a 3-year-old child in the African village, it is certainly not a problem for a 4-year-old American child. Similarly, while pondering over the family's next day's meal could prevent a problematic situation to a below the poverty line household, it could be the least of a situation to a very wealthy family. It follows also that while country or region A may find it perplexing to solve the welfare equation, country or region B will do the same with joy. The conclusion here is that the complexity of this law of relativity as a development paradigm issue becomes real when one mistakenly sees another person's problem and uses different prescription to deal with the issue. Should that be the case, the emerging development opportunities for Africa will be missed. Scarce resources will have been misallocated and wasted. And certainly, the actual problem could intensify unconsciously. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much, SID, for giving me a wonderful opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here. The world has changed in development. We can see three major changes: new players, new circumstances, new modalities. As you know, the global philanthropies, international NGOs, and private corporations are major private aid players, and new development partners or emerging donors have become significant providers of development cooperation. Their growing role represents new challenges as they have unique priorities and operate differently than traditional donors. New circumstances of aid include a greater number of fragile states and broadly recognized need for capacity development and the emergence of global public goods, through which a significant amount of aid funds are channeled. New modality. Transparent data is essential for new forms of aid delivery. South-South cooperation is becoming increasingly significant. It is a tremendous asset, bringing greater diversity and allowing for project differentiation based on shared experience. Scaling up is widely recognized as a valuable method for generating effective outcomes. Among these three major changes, I would like to focus on new players, especially new development partners and global development partnership. Over the last few years, a number of new economic powers have become important players in the aid architecture as donors. They have gained recent attention because of their growing economies and their stronger influence as regional and global players. The volume of official development assistance from new economic powers is growing and significant. In 2008, China provided ODA $3.8 billion. Saudi Arabia reported $5.6 billion. ODA disbursement from new development partners increased from $1 billion to $14 billion from 1995 to 2008. It is estimated that they will provide about 14% of the world's ODA this year. New dimension is clearly being added to development cooperation, and particularly for Africa. where aid from traditional donors is losing its relative exclusivity. While DEC countries provide ODA $24 billion to Africa in 2008, China offered Africa $10 billion in concessional loans during 2010 to 12. India also promised in 2008 to allocate $5.4 billion in line of credit to Africa in the next 5 years. It is clear that new development partners are generally operating outside the existing structures and frameworks, such as the OECD Development Assistance Committee. New development partners represent an important challenge to the status quo. Most new partners accept the Paris Declaration as recipient countries, but do not see it as a framework for their own bilateral development cooperation activities. As aid donors, many of these countries do not report their ODA figures, do not abide by the principles of the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. For their perspectives, it is quite natural. For new development partners, there are few incentives for new development partners to provide aid within the confines of the established international aid architecture. The rise of new development partners increase the need for new mechanisms to share and coordinate information about aid. It is important to acknowledge the differences the new development partners have in terms of their experiences, resources, and the level of economic, political development. If the global community wishes these new donors to abide by the guidelines developed primarily by traditional donors, it may be necessary to allow flexibility among new donors. For example, donors could be divided into 3 categories. Group 1 would be the traditional donors who are members of the OECD DEC. Group 2 would be those either OECD or EU member countries who have not yet joined the DEC for one reason and another. And Group 3 would comprise all other new donors who do not fall into the second category. Based on such categorization, Group 3 countries will have a high degree of flexibility in the application of guidelines in view of their particular circumstances and unique challenges as a donor and recipient of ODA at the same time. On the other hand, Group 2 countries will have to strive to adhere to the guidelines as closely as possible. If the global community could agree on such a tiered application of guidelines, international development institutions would then be charged to ensure the application of the guidelines through well-established procedures, such as peer review, regular reporting, and the publication of progress reports. A downside of such a mechanism would be the unavoidable dilution effect that the tiering will bring on the effectiveness of the guidelines. However, the global community must make a policy choice between no guidelines and modified guidelines for new donors. We also have to remind ourselves that the concept of common but differential responsibility is well established in other policy dialogues, especially, for example, in environmental discussions. One conspicuous advantage of such an arrangement is that the international donor community will end up with a set of bottom-line standards for all donors. In other words, we'll be able to make a kind of international standards evolve in such a way that upholds a common vision for development and also allows a variation in the responsibilities. If the global community allows flexibility to the newcomers in the application of guidelines and engages them in an agenda-setting process, The partnership between traditional donors and new development partners and the global development partnership will be greatly strengthened. And they could increase their global engagement to broaden positive effect, which will contribute to the establishment of more horizontal global policymaking in development area. The global community should make efforts to strengthen and broaden the global development partnership, and also to create common guidelines that all stakeholders, including new development partners and private aid players, can support. Finally, I would like to talk about briefly fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness in 2011. As you know, Korea will host the fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness on international summit, in which government and civic leaders from all developed and developing countries will assess ongoing global efforts to make aid more effective. The high-level forum in Korea would hold a special meaning as the first such a gathering in Asia, in the region where an increasing number of emerging donors and partners in need coexist. The first high-level forum will address the three major changes I have mentioned, and the high-level forum should strengthen the global development partnership by establishing common guidelines for all donors. I hope Seoul Declaration or that will reflect Bari Plus agenda will be announced in high-level forum in Seoul in 2011. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So last year, I came before you as a very green new public servant who'd been in office, I think, 3 months. Now I recognize I'm an old, seasoned hand. And one way I define that is I looked up and I thought, yes, it's April. And when this invitation came in, I thought, yes, it's the annual SID meeting. And that is already part of my, my government routines, all of which is to say I'm pleased to be back here. And I hope I can say at least a few things differently than what I said last year, and I know there'll be lots of questions. Last year, actually, I talked to you about what I would call a new paradigm of foreign policy, which was, in a word, I won't go through it again, and you've heard it from Secretary Clinton herself now, essentially a view of foreign policy that says focusing on the solution of global problems from the bottom up. In other words, from at the level at which our policies affect the daily lives of human beings is as important as focusing on problems from the top down, meaning the traditional bilateral or multilateral government-to-government level. That is a new paradigm of foreign policy, and Secretary Clinton and President Obama hope that will be a hallmark of their time in office and a legacy. It is not just driven, I think, by their own convictions. It's driven by the nature of global events and the types of problems we face. I tell people that in the countless lists that I have to draw up of foreign policy priorities, only non-proliferation is not directly connected to development, and I could make connections there too, but all the others, whether it's terrorism and violent extremism, the stability of the global economy, climate change, global pandemics, resource scarcity, all of them have a strong development component as well as a strong diplomatic component. So that, I think, is a new paradigm. And I'm always happy to talk about new paradigms. It's like being back at Princeton. That's what academics spend their time inventing new paradigms. But I actually want to say when it comes to development, our development policy, I don't think we have a new paradigm. Now I'm going to say, before I go on, that may change when the presidential study on development comes out, and so nothing that I'm about to say should prejudge that. But at least to the extent we have articulated our development policy to date, I don't think it's a new paradigm. It's not about necessarily doing what we do differently. It's about how we do it better. It's about making what we do more effective. So really recognizing all the changes that the previous two speakers have articulated so well, and that are, I really think, the defining features of the development landscape that we look at. How do we make our development, our foreign assistance, our development policy maximally effective in that framework? So I would start by defining what I mean by effective. And here I would say effective foreign assistance is foreign assistance, and I understand the differences between foreign assistance and development, but here let me say foreign assistance. Foreign assistance that builds the capacity of governments to provide for their people and builds the capacity of people to provide for themselves. That's the definition I would overall use. Now, that definition itself assumes a number of the basic principles of foreign aid effectiveness, the Paris Declaration or the Accra Principles, however you want to describe them, in that it starts with, of course, a focus on governments. The first thing I said was effective foreign assistance that builds the capacity of governments to provide for their people. So that, of course, is a direct reference to the first basic principle of foreign aid effectiveness, country-led development plans. And in the QDDR, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, we're spending a lot of time figuring out how to implement that principle, the principle of supporting governments in enabling them to provide for their people, how we implement that at the ground level, not just at the level of rhetoric, but actually what we do. And the most obvious consequence of thinking that way is in part priorities and where do you provide the most development assistance, and that must be governments who are not only have strong development plans, but also are transparent enough that you can actually measure what they're doing with their funds. But the first consequence of that principle is to move the process of formulating the development strategy with respect to a particular country much more to the country itself, something that is not going to be news to any of you, but is important to try to work through as we put in place the specific processes of developing and implementing strategies. That's true not only at the level of formulating the precise development strategy, but also the diplomatic strategy that has to go with it. The strategy that says we support a particular government with respect to its development plan, but what goes along with that is that our diplomats, not just our development experts in a country, but our diplomats are equally engaged in trying to hold the government to its plan, in indicating how important performance on that plan is to us as a political matter, not just as traditionally a development or an economic or a social matter. So when I talk about formulating that strategy, it's the strategy from the embassy as well as from the mission or from the MCC office or the PEPFAR office. The second principle, again well known to you, is a much more comprehensive approach. Now again, this has to be done within the context of the country's own development plan. But for instance, if we are focusing on food security or global health, food security, as you've seen our strategy, is not just about the farmers, but about the distribution systems, about the infrastructure, about nutrition, a much more comprehensive effort to address the roots of the problem, again consistent with the government's own priorities. Or in health, a much greater focus on strengthening the entire health system than on particular provision of medical assistance. The third area where we focused is coordinating among all those donors that you've heard about. And here, I often think that the standard American can-do stereotyped attitude does not help us, because increasingly as I look out over this landscape of multiple donors, the government donors and the new government donors and the different categories of the new government donors, and then all the NGOs, all the foundations, and the multilateral organizations. When I look over that landscape, it strikes me that our impulse, and certainly as a government official, when we're formulating a policy, we always think, well, we're going to do something new. We're going to do an additional thing. I think we might be better guided by the old principle of don't just do something, stand there. In this case, it would be don't just do something, stop and learn what other people are doing. The starting point, and this is something, a matter of knowledge management technology, but the starting point for us should often be to map as much as we can what everyone else is already doing, and then figure out how we can connect them or enable them to do it better. Again, as I said, that's in part a matter of knowledge management technology. My office has actually been working with Google Maps to try to see what we could actually develop to be able to have the equivalent of being able to move your mouse over a part of a country and see what's actually happening. So the coordination is well known to us, but before you can coordinate, you really have to have a far more extensive ability to map who's out there. The collaboration, which is connected but distinct from coordination, collaboration with other big donors, with multilateral institutions in particular, and large donors, this goes increasingly to the issue of division of labor. Now, our foreign assistance budget has a few political strings attached. So the idea that we're just going to do one sector in a country or two sectors in a country is not possible, even if that's exactly how we wanted to go. So the idea of division of labor has to be done in the context of political realities. But assuming we have some flexibility, you've heard both Secretary Clinton and Administrator Shah say we want to find a more limited number of sectors in which we can really go deep, where we can be the world-class experts. You turn to the United States in those areas in particular. That implies collaborating with, obviously, the multilateral development banks, with DFID, with the other major donors in specific countries, but even more broadly in terms of specific sectors. Finally, in the C category of aid effectiveness, consistency over the long term. And here I'll just say we'll do our best, or are trying to do our best, at the holy grail of multi-year budgeting to be able to do consistent support. And again, you've seen an effort to do that in the Food Security Initiative and also the Global Health Initiative. Our final area of focus is what I often think of as metrics, metrics, metrics. We have an entire group in the QDDR looking at how to build, both to develop new metrics and to be connected to those entities at MIT and elsewhere that are specialized in looking at metrics, but also how to build that into accountability structures for people on the ground, with the aim of giving people more autonomy on the ground, but in return for that autonomy, an ability to be accountable on fairly clearly defined metrics. This, again, as you know, is an area that Administrator Shah has been particularly focused on. So, if you think about those broad principles, the Paris Declaration principles, and you take my point that in development itself, what we're trying to do is do what we already do, but far more effectively, and build that in to what we do in USAID and the other development agencies, and also connect it to what we do in diplomacy. I want to close with a slightly different idea, one that is connected, but if I were to think more in terms of a new paradigm, if I were to push it further, I'd like to close with actually something that I heard from, not from USAID, but from DFID. In talking to my counterpart at DFID, I said, you know, what makes you so effective? And he said, well, as we look at it, 3 broad features. The first, more autonomy on the ground. That, again, that's something we're certainly aiming for, and we understand. The ability on the ground, to plan on the ground, to fund on the ground, to respond to the country's needs on the ground, to coordinate on the ground. So relative autonomy on the ground. Second, access back home. So autonomy on the ground coupled with access back home. Access back home to whom? Well, obviously to other parts of government. And this is something that actually we've worked on in the Presidential Study Directive and in the QDDR, the ability to have access to the highest diplomatic levels, but also to other government agencies that can supply capacity, whether that's health or agriculture, the ability to get immediately and effectively to other high-level ministers at home, but also access at the level of the development institutions, the multilateral banks, the IFIs. The argument there was being able to connect bilateral diplomacy to multilateral diplomacy, having that access was critical in addition to autonomy on the ground. And the last feature, which is perhaps on a panel on new paradigms, the right place to end, was, in his words, the ability to be part of a global knowledge network, the ability on the ground to be the catalyst for important development conversations, and the ability to plug into that global knowledge network in such a way that DFID is constantly learning and teaching and spreading what other people know. That, to me, is a model worth thinking about as we talk about new paradigms, and it's closely tied to my point about don't just do something, stand there. Don't just do something, learn. Increasingly, as we look out on what everybody agrees is this radically changed landscape crowded with players, I think we should be thinking about how do we, instead of doing more things, stop and figure out what we're already doing, what we already know but don't necessarily know how we know, and how we transfer that knowledge, make it easily accessible, make it part of what all of us do. Take that global knowledge network, combine it with autonomy in the ground and access in capitals. I don't know if it's all the way to a new paradigm, but I do think it's the secret to effective foreign assistance. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you to all 3 of our speakers. I think they have, certainly as I listen to them, set up, I think, some interesting dynamics here for our questions, Q&A time. Let me begin by repeating what I said at the outset, or when I was making the introductions, and that is that Anne Marie will have to leave just a little bit earlier than we close this session. So I'm going to ask if there are questions that are specifically directed to her. We'll try and take those first. We have 3 roving mics that are out there. I think the 1, 2, and where's number 3? Over here. 1, 2, 3, over here. 1, 2, we're at the center? Okay. Got him. If you're interested in asking a question, I hope you all are, let me see your hands, and we'll direct the mic to you. We have one over here, right over here in this corner. For that microphone, we have one here in the middle, here for somebody. How about over there? We have one over there. And we have somebody else here. I'm going to go with this one, two, and hopefully we'll find somebody else in here. Try to keep your questions as short as possible. We'll pass we have our panelists will stay seated for the answers here, and we'll try to go through as many questions as we possibly can. And please identify yourself when you begin to speak. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. My name is Suleiman Baum with IREX. And basically, I just have a question, and I think it's hopefully even you could be part of the answer, Congressman Colby. Basically, the question is, I'm a little bit confused in terms of history is my favorite subject, but here we're talking a lot about social innovation and new paradigms. But could a new paradigm be something that has worked in the past, brought back into these times? So and the example would be if the Marshall Fund kind of helped Western Europe after World War II. If that was a successful model, could that be a model that would be applicable to a specific area, a part of the world today? Thank you.
Okay. I could certainly throw something in here, but I'd rather call on our panelists here first. What do you think? Is the Marshall Plan replicable today? Or was there something that was so different about it that there's not a way we can deal with it, use it today? Who would like to start? Anne, representing the U.S., will start with you down there.
I don't think the scale of the Marshall Plan is replicable today. It would have been $500 billion in today's currency, which if we had $500 billion to be spent, I think probably President Obama would be paying down our debt. But what is, I think, applicable is, in many ways, the Marshall Plan was exactly an example of country-led development. One of the most important dimensions of the Marshall Plan was that it wasn't, here's money to do X. It was, here's a pot of money. You governments come up with a plan as to how to spend it. We will review that plan, and then you will get the money. So in many ways, the first principle of aid effectiveness today is exactly the same principle as the Marshall Plan.
Any other comments? Toga.
I would like to just throw another dimension on that. I think I've heard in several quarters as well where people are calling for the replication of the Marshall Plan, particularly in regions that are still at very low social and economic destructive patterns. What you are talking about, that money was raised perhaps from one donor. I don't know how many people at that time when the plan was being implemented in Europe, how many donors came to the plate. Now, in 2010, where we are now, if you were to open a basket and you start calling on donors for us to come and raise that kind of money, the chances are we will be able to raise both in terms of cash, in terms of kind, and in terms of human resources to do the job.
Yeah, just to briefly, the Marshall Plan it is not easy to apply the Marshall Plan per se today, but the area, I think I would like to highlight the area of Marshall Plan. Well, actually, Korean is quite interested in economic growth aspects for poverty reduction. And also, we would like to look at closely the importance of infrastructure. In order to reduce poverty reduction, I think the economic growth is quite essential. And also for economic growth, the infrastructure is really needed. So I think in terms of the importance of infrastructure, I think we can think about it. Thank you.
The fact that I'm a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund does not make me an expert on the Marshall Plan. But I would just add one comment to what was said and what Anne-Marie said as to one other reason why I think it would be difficult to replicate that. When we look at the areas of the world today where we see the greatest need for development, what was different about Europe at the end of World War II was devastated as it was, the fundamental basic underlying infrastructure was still there, whether you're talking about the education levels, the railroads, all the kinds of things that were needed had to be repaired and restored and brought back, but it was the underlying underpinnings and foundations for it were there. It's a very different model that we're talking about in other parts of the world today. The next second question's over here, and panelists don't have to, everybody doesn't have to feel they have to answer each question, so we'll just go down and see what kinds of answers we get. Yes?
My name is Fatma Lu. I come from Tanzania, Zanzibar. Thank you very much to the three panelists. My issue is particularly to Mr. Mentish, I hope I say it right, the Executive Director of World Bank. Given what has been said here, and given that we are told that it is not a paradigm shift, given that we know that Africa is the richest in resources, but the resource management is poor, and given that on the continent there is also a dynamic of regions coming together like the East African Community, and I know from your regions, and it is really coming together. I would like to know your view on Pan-Africanism. Is it a force to reckon with? In your definition is of one size does not fit all. How will Pan-Africanism fit Africa? Thank you.
Excellent question. Mr. McIntosh, I think that's for you. Others may comment, but I think you're the one to really answer that.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. In fact, in setting your question, you laid the real premise when you talk about resource endowment. Now, you're talking about natural resource endowment that would need to be manipulated into value resources. And this is where the human capital comes to play. Because with the resources you're referring to, yes, we have water, we have land, we have forests, we have diamond, we have oil, we have all these things that if you can marshal them appropriately and apply your new techniques, you begin to add value to them. And if you then spread the value and the wealth, you will get us out of this poverty we are in. So you are right. We need to focus a little bit on the question of resource management. Now, we have discovered that the way to go is for us to collaborate, because you're now dealing with an external world, a smaller world than it was 50, 100 years ago. And if we do not get together, this is your point of regionalization, and how do we come together as a region? Everywhere we go, we hear the word Africa, Africa, but you are talking about countries. And we have to catch on to that word Africa rather than countries. And my own feeling is, I agree with you that this is where we need to put our emphasis, Pan-Africanism. But Pan-Africanism, I don't think we really mean closing doors. I don't think we really mean, looking at the world differently, but it's pulling our human and our natural resources together to get our people out of poverty and to be better equipped to engage the rest of the world, to be, have a common position to engage the rest of the world. So, my dear sister, we are both on the same line. I'm a Pan-Africanist myself. I hope that we will find time where we can have our universities tied up together, our research centers tied up together, and our engagement with the international community have a sense of purpose and direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do either of the other panelists want to comment on that? All right, we have a question now in the center here. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Anja Tingbo from Africare. Thank you for the presentation. My question is for Mr. Gaiwea. In your presentation, you touched on a very important point, is the social dimension, the socio-economic aspects of, of development in Africa. I want to put that in the context of the food security, the global food problems. We know that in Africa, the socio-economic dimension with the food security is the growth of the population. And then unfortunately, the size of arable lands don't go with the same pace. We had a population with a high number, and then the farms didn't cope with the size of the population. That's one aspect. The second aspect is the level of education of Africans now. And this goes with the change of their diet. You have to admit with me that now if you are educated, what we used to eat in the past, some of the crops are left behind. So that's the social aspect of the food crisis. So with education, I don't have anything against it. But if you put the whole thing, economy and socio-economic